This video is sponsored by BetterHelp. Hey guys, so by now we probably have hundreds of videos online giving their opinion about why the live action Avatar is hot dog water. And in all honesty, this video series that I'm going to be doing in the future is probably going to be a pretty critical one, but I wanted to start out on a positive note. For all the mediocre or just straight up bad stuff that the live action version chose to do, there were some genuinely good decisions that were made, and how they came about might not be necessarily easy to spot. For those of you who are new here, I've spent the better part of 10 years as a script and novel editor, as well as authoring 5 books myself, so needless to say, I love writing and breaking down the technical aspects of storytelling. Hopefully what I can do today is point out some of these writing concepts for those who are trying to improve their own writing, and for those who are just fans of Avatar. The first thing that we're going to have to talk about is how to think about adaptations in the first place, because it gets a bit into narrative philosophy. Adaptations, no matter how close they are to the source material, are definitionally their own fictions. That means the characters, the events, the plotting, and everything else has the freedom to be different and most likely will be. The whole point of adaptation is to not create a one-to-one clone of the source material, because at that point you wouldn't need to remake the source material at all. In the overwhelming majority of cases, adaptations are made to show narrative elements that were not included in the source material. This either comes in the form of completely new material or alterations to existing material. A great example of everything that I'm talking about is the Last of Us live action show on HBO. There was completely new material included that gave us a different perspective on the world and how the people inside functioned. And there were also alterations to existing material that tweaked our perception of the story in nuanced ways. And much like the Last of Us live action, the Avatar live action had these types of changes as well. The difference though is that many of the changes weren't for the better. The new material and the alterations to the existing source material often didn't contribute in any meaningful way. In fact, some could argue that the changes made were an overall net negative, and some of those people arguing that are going to be me in future videos, but we must also be honest in saying that some of the changes were genuinely good and acted as interesting and impactful additions and alterations to the narrative. And almost every single one of those positive changes revolved around the firebenders, especially Zuko and Iroh. These characters disproportionately benefited from the live-action remake more than anyone else, and the reasons for it are actually pretty interesting. But just before we dive in, I did want to give a shout out to today's sponsor, BetterHelp. Therapy is one of the most important decisions that some people make in their entire lives. Now, I might be a bit biased on that subject, seeing as I have my master's in psychology and worked as a clinician, but honest to God, I only hold that opinion because I think it's true. Having a therapeutic relationship with someone who knows the ins and outs of psychology is different than just venting to a friend. A good clinician can help you become a better expert on yourself. They can help you challenge yourself and grow in ways that you didn't think possible. And to find these clinicians, BetterHelp is a resource I've heard praised over and over again. It connects you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen and help you reach your goals. With BetterHelp, you can have your therapy sessions as a phone call, as a video chat, or even via messaging if you prefer that, whichever is the most comfortable version of therapy for you. If you think you might benefit from therapy, consider BetterHelp. Click the link in the description or visit betterhelp.com/savagebooks. BetterHelp can match you to one of over 30,000 therapists in their network, which gives you access to a wider range of expertise than may be available in your specific area. If the therapist your first match with doesn't feel right, which is, pretty common in therapy, you can easily switch to a new therapist at no additional cost without stressing about insurance, who's in your network, or anything like that. I know this is a really big step for some of y'all out there, but if it helps, clicking my link not only supports the channel, it also gets you 10% off your first month of BetterHelp so you can connect with a therapist and see if it helps you. Go on and check it out. Now, getting back to Avatar. Zuko, Iroh, and the Firebenders at large benefited from the live-action remake, but why? Well, at the core of it, it's because of the shift in tone. See, the original animated series more or less had a light and accessible tone. And by tone, I mean the narrative's mood and attitude and seriousness. Avatar was a kid show and was unapologetic about being funny, silly, and unserious. Even the combat of the show was light and cartoony, considering there weren't realistic consequences to much of the violence shown. Aang is a 12-year-old kid, but he can be launched into buildings and break roofs and be perfectly fine. We watchers understood that we shouldn't nitpick injuries or fire not causing burns because the combat was an artistic expression of combat. conflict, not a realistic depiction of violence. People really didn't die or get hurt on screen, and that's okay. All the really tough violence either happens off screen or is implied. The mastery of the original show, though, was it establishing a light, unserious tone, but when real pain and injury did happen, it struck like a truck. Katara being burned stood out. Aang being shot by lightning stood out. Avatar knew when and how to get serious while still maintaining an overall light tone. However, the live-action Netflix show is completely different. From the opening scene, the live-action show establishes a very serious, consequential interrogation of violence and death. The firebenders aren't shooting orange Play-Doh anymore. Their bending will literally incinerate people. What this serious depiction of violence does is establish a much darker tone for the narrative. It demonstrates there will be consequences to actions and heightens the threat of the villains. And we see this played out in real time by how the firebenders absolutely massacre the air nomads. Like, the things they do to them are genuinely horrific. This on-screen depiction of violence cements a tone that will be a more genuine, grounded exploration of the hardships caused by the war, the difficulty of traveling across the world, and the consequences of challenging Imperial... I'm kidding. None of that happens at all.
You versus me. To the death.
A serious issue with the show is that it doesn't attempt to match or keep consistent with the dark, serious tone it establishes early on. Team Avatar is near constantly involved with Power Rangers-esque plot events and moral dilemmas. In many instances, there's a clear lack of seriousness to the show, which is super strange considering the dark tone that it constantly reverts back to. Even worse, the live action does not have any of the charm that the animated series did. So when Team Avatar does have to engage with actual serious situations, the reactions seem so uncharismatic, stiff, and out of place. It's fine to watch teenagers deal with world-shattering events in animation because there's a level of suspended disbelief innate to that medium. It's another thing entirely to literally see a 14-year-old shout about friendship and family to stop a cataclysm.
And the world needs you.
But I'm keeping to my word that this is not an exclusively critical video. The reason I point this incongruity in tone out is because the serious, dark tone is never used to actually investigate what it would be like for two teenagers who never left their small village to travel across the world with a little kid who just learned everybody he loved was dead, while also realizing he is the spiritual god king that needs to save the world. Live action anything is predisposed to have a more grounded tone, but the show never looks at Sokka and Katara's homesickness, or Aang's culture shock at being 100 years behind the world, or anything else that would be a more genuine look at their struggle. The idea of teenagers traveling across the world on their own is too silly to be taken seriously, which makes the adventure itself feel a bit out of place. But you know whose adventure works perfectly for a more serious interpretation? Prince Zuko and Uncle Iroh. It's actually jarring the difference in effectiveness that the tone has for our Fire Nation boys versus Team Avatar. Let me explain. As said, Aang, Katara, and Sokka's journey of crossing the world, solving problems, getting into romance flings, and making friends runs counterintuitive to the serious investigative dark tone of the live-action show, meaning almost all new or altered material will feel strange. However, Zuko's story being about a banished prince physically abused by his father, sent on an impossible task in order to reclaim his honor and identity, runs perfectly in line with the darker, serious tone. And that means the new and altered material included in the live-action show has the chance to bolster Zuko's narrative, not hinder it. The same thing can be said for Uncle Iroh. The Fire Nation side of the story is a fundamentally much more serious one, and the show takes advantage to investigate the real consequences and reactions that come with it. In fact, let's take a look at Iroh as our first example. The first season of the animated show sets him up as basically the stereotypical Yoda character. He is the wise, powerful old mentor character that we've seen time and time again. What makes Iroh unique and interesting is that he is not the Yoda character for the hero, but for the antagonist. He's an obstacle standing in the way of our main characters, a character with blood on his hands, but one that still seems to have morals and a guided nature. Obviously, Iroh was one of the more nuanced characters in the show, if not the most nuanced, but it took multiple seasons to unpack the complexity of what made Iroh so great. In the early parts of the animated show, he was simply meant to be the wise mentor that was around to calm the raging fire that was Zuko. And because of the simplicity surrounding his character early on and the levity of the tone, there wasn't much of a genuine interaction with his past. What I mean by that is that Iroh's history of being on the oppressor's side in the war is mostly flavor text and is not really taken seriously early.
Ah, the great city of Ba Sing Se.
It was greater than you were, apparently.
I acknowledge my defeat at Ba Sing Se. After 600 days away from home, my men were tired, and I was tired.
Iroh being the general responsible for sieging the largest city in the world, and in turn being responsible for mass murder, is largely played up as a joke. Iroh doesn't seem to show any remorse for it, while the earthbender he is talking to is clearly personally insulted and bothered by the loss that Iroh caused. And again, the reason Iroh's war campaign is yada yada'd away with little emotional depth is because the light tone of the show wouldn't mix well with the unpacking of possible war crimes. Obviously, later on, we learn more about Iroh's thoughts on his past, but not now. Things are a bit different though with the live action. Through the addition and alteration of a few scenes, Iroh becomes a much more immediately complex character because the new darker tone can take his past seriously. The altered version of the animated scene we just watched is much more genuine, even though I couldn't find a clip for it. Instead of just berating Iroh, the earthbender tells him about the terrors of the years-long siege that Iroh led against Ba Sing Se, how Iroh burned entire regiments of soldiers on the wall, and how the earthbender's brother's body was charred so badly that there wasn't even enough left to bury. Iroh, and by extension the audience, has to sit in the pain that he caused and hear how his actions traumatically hurt others. It's a small change, but one that adds depth and realism to Iroh's exhibited calmness and kindness. His killing in war is no longer a joke, but a scar that he must carry for all his life. And remember, this earthbender beats him, nearly kills him by crushing him with a boulder, but when freed and allowed to take revenge, Iroh demonstrates the restraint of his convictions and shows mercy.
Do it! We've all seen enough death.
Again, this was not in the cartoon. Zuko and Iroh just beat the piss out of all the earthbenders. But the live action chooses to accentuate the depravity Iroh exhibited in the past with the forgiveness and peace he embodies now. Another core element of the Netflix adaptation is allowing us more time with the characters, if even in completely new situations. And these new situations can show us sides of the characters that we previously had to wait much longer to see. For example, in the last stages of season 2, Aang is able to talk to Iroh and receive some advice from him. It was a very cool moment that deepened Iroh as a character, showing someone we once thought of as an antagonist actually benefiting our hero with his wisdom. Iroh's openness and compassion, his treatment with Aang and Toph even, foreshadowed his plot events that later came and the morals that he would hold down the line.
Sometimes life is like this dark tunnel. You can't always see the light at the end of the tunnel, but if you just keep moving, you will come to a better place. You sound like my nephew. Always thinking you need to do things on your own without anyone's support. There is nothing wrong with letting people who love you help you.
This is brought earlier in the Netflix show though. Aang talks to Iroh immediately after he is captured, and for an audience who had maybe never seen the show, this is a display of how Iroh doesn't endorse the war or the violence of the Fire Nation or even the capture of the Avatar. He may be on the side of the Fire Nation, but he's not like the other men of the military. Again, it's more of an immediate complexity for the character and shows some engaging introspection. And to cap it off, one of the best things that the live action adaptation was able to accomplish with its new and altered content was setting a more emotional groundwork for Iroh and Zuko's relationship. For a watcher of the animation's first season, much of the understanding of their relationship comes from witnessing how they treat each other on their journey. It's good writing, honestly, because it's showing.
Disgraceful. Even in exile, my nephew is more honorable than you. Thanks again for the tea.
Did you really mean that, Uncle?
Of course. I told you ginseng tea is my favorite.
But because the animated series shows so much, the depiction can also make their relationship appear rocky at times.
I don't need your help keeping order on my ship.
It isn't until the end of season 1 that we start to get a foundation for why Iroh cares so much about Zuko.
Well, ever since I lost my son,
Uncle, you don't have to say it.
I think of you as my own.
Now, don't get me wrong, I am not criticizing the original series for poor pacing, just pointing out that the foundation of Iroh and Zuko's relationship was backloaded in the show. It's also interesting to note that for the animated series, any background we do get is based in why Iroh is bonded to Zuko, but not why Zuko is close to Iroh. How the Netflix live action show, in my mind, improves upon this is doing their work much earlier and much more emotionally. Instead of waiting until the end of the season, the groundwork of Iroh and Zuko's relationship is established earlier in episode 4 and brilliantly focuses on Zuko's attachment to his uncle. Instead of having to imagine the pain of Iroh mourning his son and how it brought him close to Zuko, we get to see it firsthand. We see the kind, caring young man that Zuko was and the love that he had for his cousin and uncle.
He said it should belong to someone destined to do great things. Gave me strength.
It's here in Iroh's greatest moment of need that Zuko stays by his side, and it affects him so deeply that he never leaves Zuko's side thereafter. For a new audience and even a familiar one, this is a fantastic way to show how our characters got to where they are. The serious, darker tone of the live action is used to show the characters in emotional pain and vulnerability, and by extension, how they overcome the struggle to emerge closer on the other side. It's a really cool addition to the narrative that the original animation couldn't pull off until it built up a lot more cachet with the audience. And speaking of Zuko, he benefits from the live action even more than Iroh, with even more significant changes. Let's start with his interactions with Zhao, another character that got huge changes. Overall, they're mostly the same. They become rivals, Zuko undermines Zhao as the Blue Spirit, and they fight at the North Pole shortly before his death. But you might have noticed one of the pivotal scenes that is missing is the Agni Kai that started their animosity. One of the reasons for this is that Zhao's character seems to fundamentally be changed for the adaptation. In the original animation, Zhao is brash, disrespectful, and brazenly haughty. In fact, the show goes out of its way to demonstrate just how much of a hothead he is. Zhao is highly confrontational and has no qualms about getting his hands bloody himself. In the Netflix live action show, Zhao's brashness and hot-headedness is traded in for a much more wormy, conniving villainy. In my opinion, Zhao was a much more despicable person in the live action because he went from a brute to a trickster and a manipulator, and honestly was someone I really wanted to punch in the face. Kudos to the actor. But most of all, he seemed like someone who only wanted the vanity of glory without having to do any hardship to get it. You'll notice that the animated Zhao is constantly fighting on the front lines, while the live action Zhao skulks and betrays. Again, it makes him that much more detestable. Honestly, he's kind of like Scar from The Lion King, which is ironic considering who his main rival is. But because of the lack of a willingness to actually engage in confrontation, live action Zhao only fights Zuko when his back is against the wall, and he's not all that impressive when he does it. From a writing perspective, this means that Zhao and Zuko's initial Agni Kai really couldn't have happened, as that fight was voluntary, which does not fit with the new Zhao's character personality. So instead of devoting time to that fight, the live action adaptation instead devoted increased time to another Agni Kai, Zuko versus Ozai, and this was again another great decision. Remember, in the original cartoon, Zuko never actually fought his father, and what's more, because the flashback was based in Ozai's perspective, we only got a second-hand telling of the events. It was still effective for establishing how Zuko had turned into the person he was, but it still involved a fair amount of telling, because Iroh was telling a story. The live action, though, uses that time to actually show us the Agni Kai, as well as utilize previously existing source material to greater effect. Not only do we get to see Ozai's prowess and power in firebending, which is just plain cool, the lesson of the animated Agni Kai is brought in here too. Instead of Zhao having to comment on Zuko's upbringing with his father, we just literally get to see Zuko with his father. And seeing Zuko's traumatic experience firsthand with him is leaps and bounds better than it happening off screen. And since the live action show did not dedicate time to doing Zuko alone, one of the best entries in season 1, it took elements from that episode and merged them beautifully with the aftermath of the Agni Kai. Take a look.
I've always had to struggle and fight, and that's made me strong. It's made me who I am.
Zuko's kind nature is shown here, even in the face of his father's harsh lesson, which is really cool because the mercy he demonstrated in the Agni Kai is the same type of mercy that Iroh showed the Earthbenders. It's a nice detail to connect them. And speaking of, while Zuko was definitely meant to be seen as an angry, impulsive, angsty teenager on the bad guy side, the original animation clearly wanted you to sympathize with him and see that he has a good heart. This is why he was shown trying to save Zhao after everything that he did to him, and why he was shown sticking up for the 41st Division when he still lived back in the Fire Nation.
Those soldiers love and defend our nation. How can you betray them?
And in possibly the best narrative move in all the episodes of the live action, they made an addition to that. Live action Zuko had been shown generally to be in conflict with his crew for almost the entire show, which is in line with the source material. And it's through these negative interactions with the crew that we watchers start to draw conclusions about Zuko's character. I mean, naturally, if all we ever see is Zuko being an angry dick, we're gonna see him as a villain. We will think that he doesn't care about people and that he's selfish. But the live action chooses to completely subvert our understanding by revealing that the crew Zuko seems to not care about was the 41st Division that he spoke up to protect all those years ago. All those men owe Zuko their lives, yet he never once lorded it over them or mentioned it. He obviously didn't want to hurt their honor or make them feel indebted to him, so he simply kept his mouth shut. Zuko lost all that he had to save the lives of people he never met before, and he's traveling with them, and he wanted nothing in return. And that narrative choice to include this action gives us the truest insight into how good Zuko is at heart. Not to mention, it gives us a great moment of Zuko being recognized by his crew and getting a much needed win. While so much of the show's darker, more serious tone is lost on Team Avatar, it is Iroh and Zuko specifically that benefit the most from having a more genuine exploration of their characters and journeys. Their conflicts and obstacles are much more akin to an adult-level drama, and while the show never completely transitions into being as hardcore as Game of Thrones, it does show us these iconic characters in a light that we had not previously seen before. There's still a lot to go over when breaking down this live action, and there'll be many more videos, hopefully. But I'm happy to say that the choices included here were among the best of them. If you want more educational info like this, make sure to also hop over to my streams. I stream every Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday at 7:30 p.m. PST. If you like what you heard, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you want to help me out like a ton, go over to my Patreon, sign up, and you get bonuses like being able to talk to me on Discord, or if you like what I said today, hire me as an editor. I will leave a link for my website in the description, and also make sure to check out our sponsor today, BetterHelp. As always, it was a pleasure, and I'll talk to you all again soon.